Good morning, everyone. I hate to stop all that good vibes out there, but you can pick it up at the end of the service. Hey, welcome to our service this morning. Glad to see all of your shining faces and smiles and laughter and just overall sweetness of harmony and unity in place. Those of you online, I hope you've picked up some of this vibe. Welcome as well. We're glad you're with us this morning as we continue on a Christmas series we started 2 weeks ago. I'm going to get into that in just a minute, but I really thought, given the time of the month, that I should give you the good news, bad news of the Christmas season, and that is you only have now 14 days left to decorate the house inside and or outside if you're doing that. More power to you, good for you. To select the exact menu you want for that special meal with people who are coming in to cook that meal or to bring your meal to someone else's home, host the meal. Of course, the obvious shop for all the gifts that you don't know exactly what you're going to do with everyone's requests, and all that, of course, not to break your budget for January. So to help you with all of this holiday cheer and challenge that comes with this season of the year, we are doing this series about the Grinch that stole Christmas. And you probably, no doubt, at some point in your youth, as a young parent, maybe some of you even as a youth, your parents read or your grandpa read to you, the Dr. Seuss book about the Grinch. If not, maybe in more recent times, although it's a 2000 Ron Howard movie with Jim Carrey as the Grinch, you watched the Grinch movie. And if you're like me, you probably forgot the theme exactly and the moral of the story. And why did he turn evil? Why is this creature that we see coming to town and ruining everyone's Christmas? Well, it of course was because of bullying that Grinch becomes this cold-hearted, unforgiving, diabolical green creature who's trying to mess everybody up. The original Grinch wasn't green. Like everyone else in that storybook, he was just black and white with a few red and pink splotches on his body. But Grinch was cruelly bullied one day at school by the other kids in his class because of his appearance, because of his looks. And he reacts angrily to that attack by throwing his gift at the Christmas tree, probably knocks it over if I recall. And his teacher, along with all the classmates, his friends, instead of offering him support and emotional understanding, they laugh at him. And so in a huff, Grinch leaves town, never to return. As he finds in isolation from all those people, his heart begins to shrink with hurt and revenge until he comes back to town as this green monster. Well, the underlying story, moral of the story, you may not remember, is that even when we've been hurt, it doesn't give us either the right or permission to hurt other people. But we all know from human experience that hurt people hurt people. You've heard it. That's right. Why? Because that is the human story of sin. And that is our defensive reaction to pain, isn't it? To react. And so we have been considering in this series some of the ways that we in life respond to our pain. We could call them our real-life Grinches, those enemies of Christian faith that shrink our hearts, shrink our faith, and isolate us from God, because we feel like maybe He's ultimately responsible, and isolate us from other people in life. We don't want to share that Grinch. And so last week, Brian talked about the Grinch of grief, which is a very common response to relational loss, family or friends, be it death, divorce, just moving away, all the different ways. In fact, I think he mentioned that grief is a common response to any kind of loss. But the week before, Ed spoke about a different kind of response to pain. He talked about the Grinch of grumbling and how these losses we have, we grumble about someone else or about our situation in life. And today I want to talk to you about the Grinch of greed. Again, another common response to loss, financial loss, especially if you were raised with very little. like I was as a young kid. I mean, I can remember a Christmas where it was just popcorn on a string around the tree and some gingerbread men on the tree that we made and ate for Christmas Day. No lights going because it's just too expensive to pay the utility bill. Christmas was not a letter to Santa asking, here's all the things I want. It was just, here's what you need, usually clothes for the next school year, next semester. And so in those situations, you can easily grab on to some form of greed. And greed shrinks our hearts. It isolates us from people, even when we're with people. But it's so easy to pursue this life path as a protection against the potential future loss and pain that comes from that aspect of life. And in reading recently some holiday business news, it is very apparent that this Grinch has a grip on very many Americans. A couple of articles, I'll read part of one. Millennials are struggling with credit card debt. Americans spend big, now overdue bills are rising. Many Americans finance their summer of spending with credit cards, and a rising number are struggling to pay those debts. Total household debt rose $228 billion during the third quarter, that's July, August, September, to hit a record $17.3 trillion, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Credit card balances now reach roughly $1 trillion in the second quarter. That was a record. They went up another $48 billion in the third quarter. Credit card debt has jumped by $154 million, the largest annual increase since the New York Fed started tracking this data in 1999. That's almost 25 years ago. Credit card balances now account for $1.1 trillion of household debt. Mortgages stood at $12 trillion, auto loans $1.6 trillion, and student debt, which we hear a lot about in the last few years, always rises in the fall, now hits $1.6 trillion. At the same time, the share of U.S. households that struggle to make timely payments on their debts also increased. The share of credit card and auto loan debt is overdue, has already surpassed pre-pandemic levels. 8% of credit cards, 7.4% of auto loans in delinquency. And here's the problem. Millennials, here's part of the problem, defined as people born between 1980 and 1994, is that you? Especially struggled to pay these credit card bills. Found that the credit card delinquency was the highest among borrowers between 30 and 39, some of our crowd. The 90-day delinquency rate, I haven't paid in 3 months, for credit card holders in that age group increased to almost 6%, up almost double from the year before. So 1 out of 16 are struggling. So as we think about the condition of our country and the people, in spite of all the affluence and things we have a problem as a people. And let's review some ancient wisdom in regards to that as we consider the problem with greed. Proverbs 11:24 says, there is one who scatters and yet increases all the more. Someone who's generous, and it seems like what goes around, comes back. And there's another one who withholds what is justly due. I'm not paying that bill. And yet it doesn't help. It results only in more want. This morning we're going to survey a few Proverbs as we look at this topic. Let me remind you as we do that the book of Proverbs is not a book of God's promises. It's often seen that way, but it really isn't. Neither is it a book of God's commands, although there's some things that we're told to do in it. What it really is a survey by Solomon and some other writers of life observation. This is how life generally works. This is how relationships generally work. This is how words in relationships generally work. This is how anger plays out, how jealousy or lust generally work in life. And this is how God's wisdom generally works to help that situation. This is true because God has established a sowing and reaping, call it cause and effect, cause and result, law of life that can neither be avoided nor ultimately broken. And the Apostle Paul actually is the one who focuses in on this law in its spiritual aspect in Galatians 6, where he writes, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Don't kid yourself. Don't think you're so smart you're going to go around this and be the one exception just because there's no immediate consequence. It doesn't work that way. What goes around will come around. He says, this is how it works. Whatever a man or woman sows, this will he or she also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from that fleshly, foolish decision reap some form of corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit, according to God's wisdom, will from the Spirit reap ultimately eternal life. Now, the world obviously doesn't see it in these words. They would say something like, this is the ounce of prevention, pound of cure kind of wisdom that they're talking about. What I find fascinating is that 3,000 years ago, Solomon, from his own life experiences, his own foolish, mistaken living, identifies what I think is really the saddest life consequence of greed. And here it is. It leads to a destiny of personal discontentment. It leads to discontentment. And in that regard, we find, and I can tell you from personal experience, that greed is a cruel taskmaster because it can never, ever say enough. I have enough. I am content. It can't say that. Proverbs 13, the righteous has enough to satisfy his appetite. I'm good, I'm full. But the stomach of the wicked is always in more need. Greed can't say enough. It always has to say, I need more, so I have to spend more. Even if I don't have it, I will borrow for today and promise to pay it back tomorrow. And of course, hence the article, no, we won't. Why? Because greed's tomorrow appetites won't let us. The appetite we're cultivating today will tell us tomorrow that we've got to have more. And thinking that we can borrow against tomorrow to pay for today's lifestyle is a foolish premise based on the false belief that we actually own tomorrow, when in fact we do not. You might remember from me over the years saying this, I'll put it up on the screen. Yesterday is a canceled check. It's over. It's been spent. Tomorrow is a promissory note. It's the check that you want to deposit and get money from. Today is the only cash we have. Spend it wisely. Folks, these are wise observations of how life really works within God's law of sowing and reaping. And what we learn is that greed is not the path to inward contentment. Neither is it a path that leads us to outward freedom. It ultimately leads us to greater slavery. As Proverbs 22 says, the borrower becomes the lender's slave. He owns you. Well, this kind of financial slavery only leaves us with a second problem. And this, I think, is really the heart of what I want to talk to you about this morning. And that is, it leads us with a legacy of wasted opportunity. A legacy of wasted opportunity. It's kind of like the story Jesus told about the guy who had to build a bigger set of barns. Remember the story? We've seen it. He was rich. He had all that he wanted already stored away. And he had this huge bumper crop on his vast estate. And he said, I don't have enough room to share it, to stow it away. I'm not going to share it and give it away, even though I don't need it. I want more. So I'm going to tear down these barns, made bigger barns that will hold it. And the mindset there is a mindset we see throughout our life that we have to contend with ourselves. It's that mindset that says the one who has the biggest barn, the one who has the biggest bank balance, the one who has the newest, best toys, that's the person that life's in that wins. But Jesus corrected, even in the story in the gospel, he said, no, that's not the person who wins. The person who wins is the person who's rich toward Jesus, toward God. That's the person who wins. Why? Because as Christ followers, life is not about living the good life. I know we all live a good life. We love our lives. I get it. But as Christians, as Christ followers, the life is not about living the good life. It's about living God's life through us. Why? Because life is not about, I know we think it's so, but life is not about our story. Life is all about God's glory and how we fit into it. So let's talk about his glory for just a moment. It's manifested to us best by his grace. And you've seen this recently. Let me put it up again on here. What is grace? Grace is God's riches at Christ's expense. Though he was rich with all the glory of heaven, he became poor through incarnation, death on the cross, so that what? So that we all could become rich in him with eternal life. And when you think about God's generosity reflected in his grace, it really does boggle all of our minds. I mean, the gap, the distance between our little lives and human greed and God's divine grace is just too much, too great to conceptually bridge in our minds. Like, I can read the story, I can read the verses, but how do I take it in? Well, it's why we never grasp it until we embrace it for ourselves. And this is the purpose of generosity. It's our preparation for eternity. I mean, you ever think about this? How do you and I actually get ready to spend our eternity in God's presence, his manifested presence? A presence that's marked by both power and purity that is so overwhelming that we read the seraphim, the angels around his throne, can't handle it. They have to protect themselves. And every time we see it manifested from Genesis to Revelation, it overwhelms the person. They are terrified. They faint dead away because it's just too much. Like all the power of a major dam going into a little 5-watt nightlight. Can't handle it. How do you get ready for that? Well, the short answer is we need to prioritize God's purpose in our life and pursue it. And so, to what end do we pursue this purpose of generosity? Well, it's twofold. First of all, it's about leveraging limited opportunity. It's about leveraging limited opportunity. See, I know that when we think about conceptually the idea of being wealthy or being rich, that on the one hand, half the world sees all of us here as incredibly rich, richer than they could ever imagine. Why? Well, because, you're going to get into a car, used, old, whatever, new, and drive off. You're going to drive on paved roads. You're going to go to a house or an apartment that has glass on the windows and screens so you can open in the summer without the mosquitoes coming in. You're going to have electricity in there. We have all those gadgets and things that you use with those, and running water and inside plumbing, and you open the refrigerator and it's filled with food. I mean, that's like, wow, that's rich. But for those of us who spent long hours working, buying, paying for, maintaining all those things, our perspective is much different. We say, well, yeah, there are people who are very rich, like Warren Buffett and Elon Musk and, Bill Gates and those kind of people. They're rich. But me, I'm just trying to pay the bills. I get it. But here's the thing. All along our life's journey, amidst the give and take of making the money and paying the bills and all that we do, God intersects our life. He stops our lives in those moments to leverage our limited opportunity by helping us learn generosity. It's kind of like the Bible story of the kid you have read and know. One day, his mom makes him a lunch, his favorite lunch, fish and breadsticks, lets him take off with a few of his village buddies, walk a couple miles out of the village to this gathering of this unsanctioned religious gathering. And he goes there and he finds this huge crowd. He's sitting with thousands upon thousands of people. And he finds a spot where he actually listens, which is pretty phenomenal, all day long, to this rabbi, Jesus, who held everybody spellbound for hours until, kind of simultaneously, all their grumbling stomachs said at once, hey, the preacher has preached too long. We're hungry. At which point, this stranger named Andy, along with his brother Pete, walking through the crowd, and Andy comes over and says, hey, do any of you guys have any food that you could contribute to feed these thousands upon thousands of hungry people? And you, the little kid, looks around and you think, nobody has any food at all. Whoa. Well, I have my lunch. I haven't eaten it yet. I'm hungry, but you know what? You can have it. It's just one lunch, not much really. I mean, what does it take to feed a kid? But it's all he had. And Jesus said, in hindsight, that was a generous choice. And it's enough. It's enough to do what I want to do. And we all know how the story ends, right? God multiplies our average exponentially, which is not yet another aspect of God's grace and purpose in generosity. Here's the second one. Not only leverage limited opportunity, but a guarantee of a compounding of maximum return. Guaranteeing maximum return, compounded. Those of you who consider yourself good in math, do you know how many zeros are in 4 sextillion, 8 quintillion dollars? You don't have to look up chat, AI. 20. Say, why are you asking? Remember the story Jesus told? He and his disciples were in Jerusalem. They're standing there by the temple, a little off, it says, and it was Sabbath service. Everybody was going through and putting their money in the boxes that would be on the wall. And he's watching it, and they're all just kind of meandering, yeah, whatever. And all of a sudden, he's, hey, guys, look. And they look over, and they see this little widow walking up. And she drops 2 mites, 2 little copper pennies. He said, you see that? Yeah. She just put in more than everybody there. They said, I don't think so, Jesus. They're dropping in silver and gold there. No. You don't see it how my Father sees it. She gave it all out of gratitude. And my Father loves that. Well, it's been calculated, and I didn't do it, so I'm going to take a calculation, that if the widow's 2 mites had been invested in the Bank of Jerusalem at 4% compound interest, it would now be worth this much. My point, if the world can compound money that way, how much more can the supernatural living God use our time, our mites? Here's 5 minutes, here's an hour, here's whatever. Our talent. Well, I can't sing, but I can hand out a bulletin. Whatever. Our treasure, how much can he compound that investment of our lives in his incredible eternal kingdom? You know, being raised in a family that sacrificed much in my early years to gain a better future, I was shaped in those formative years to be what I would call thrifty. Some might say frugal. That's a much better term than greedy, right? People who've known me over the years might occasionally say, Dave, you're not thrifty, you're just cheap. And I suppose that was true to a large degree at certain times. And it was interesting to me how God strategically waited to break the power of greed in me through generosity. He actually waited until I was midway through my life, until we built this facility, really, that you're sitting in this morning. We called it Future Generations, and we built it almost 25 years ago for all of you, future generations, that are now here enjoying it. At the time, the leaders wanted this to be a blessing, not a burden to you. So we didn't take out a long 30-year loan and so forth to build this facility. We didn't borrow against the future, which is our today, to pay for today's bill. Instead, we sacrificed. And I asked the church to sacrifice for 3 years, which turned into 5 years, in order to pay this off, so we don't have any mortgage. We're free to use all of our resources for ministry. And while I was doing that asking, that's when the Spirit of God said to me, okay, Dave, if you're going to talk the talk, it's time for you to walk the walk. I want you to give a double tithe for this next year's. To which I said, say what? But it was clear that I couldn't really lead without being generous myself. So that's what Louise and I did. And at the time, I didn't really know how we were going to be able to do that, honestly. I really didn't. But what was amazing is that along with our sacrifice over those years, God provided some unexpected, amazing financial gifts that came our way, that we were able to just pass on to fulfill our commitment. And during that time, the power of greed, I really believe, was broken in me by that generosity. Just as this verse I'm going to read to you became true for me, Proverbs 11:25, the generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. Not only did I receive some of those unexpected gifts, but the best gift I received during those 3 years was his grace gift of contentment that came through generosity. And that's the result of the law of sowing and reaping. What we reap from sowing generously and generosity is contentment. I have enough. I'm good. Thanks, Lord. And a confidence that our life investment is being compounded exponentially by God. And one day, before God's throne, you and I, each one of us, we're going to see the final outcome of all of our investments, of our time, our talent, as well as our treasure. We're going to see how God used our sacrifices, our generosity, now compounded by his power through his plan for his purposes. Let me illustrate what I mean. This is just one thread. God has so many multiple millions of threads going on, only he could track all this. But here's one thread. One day in Boston, in 1858, a Sunday school teacher by the name of Kimball walked downtown Boston into a shoe store to talk to one of his young students, class students, about Christ. His name was Dwight. Dwight became a Christian. Some of you might know him as D.L. Moody. And he became an evangelist, not particularly well educated, but a man of great passion. 20 years after that, later in life, in 1879, he preached a crusade, actually in England. And though it had mixed results, English not exactly sure what to do with this young, brash American, in his preaching, he awakened evangelistic zeal of a pastor who was in a small, struggling church who attended with his few people, who was thinking maybe of not continuing. His name was F.B. Meyer. He later was the author of a few New Testament Bible commentators, became very much popular and powerful in his preaching, and later came to America, reversing Moody's path, and preached on the campus of Yale College. At that time, he brought to conversion through his preaching a young student named J. Wilbur Chapman. who later, after graduating Yale, decided to go into ministry and went to work with the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. And as a minister for the YMCA, he employed a recently converted baseball player, a young man by the name of Billy Sunday, who was very impassioned, to go preach a series of sermons in Charlotte, North Carolina. Sunday's preaching so impassioned a group of local Christian farmers and lay people that they planned, after Sunday left and went back to Chicago, they planned a second series of meetings. But thinking now it would be better to, instead of bringing someone from afar, to bring someone who is closer at hand, a regional name, evangelist. And so they brought evangelist Mordecai Ham to preach. To those meetings that all these local Charlotte farmers and businessmen and people arranged for, old dairy farmer Graham had a son, Billy, who decided to attend. And there, under Mordecai Ham's preaching, he decided to trust Christ. Now, that's a name you recognize, right? So every time Billy Graham preached, now he's in glory, and he gave the call, and people walked the aisle and trusted Christ, what happened? Well, their eternal destiny was certainly changed for good, right? But what's not thought of is this. Kimball's 1858 video in heaven got longer as his interest on his spiritual investment was exponentially compounded by God over and over and over and over again. Do you see? Can you grasp how God's purpose for generosity works? God wants to bless all of us for all eternity. For all eternity. And God doesn't need much. He just needs our average. He just needs our 2 mites. He just needs our little lunch or whatever. He only needs a little with our gratitude, because he can't use and won't multiply our greed. Our greed is a dead end. It sticks with us and it dies with us. It's a dead end. But our gratitude, that reflects his divine nature and grace. And that he blesses beyond imagination. So let's talk for a moment about the path of gratitude. It's also found in Solomon's ancient wisdom, Proverbs 3. He writes, honor the Lord from your wealth. You say, wait, I'm not wealthy. No, here's the second one. And from the first of all your produce. That would be your paycheck, your time, your things that you have. Why? So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. So here's the thing. Every time we choose to be generous out of gratitude, we are making a faith decision. A faith decision. Our attitude of gratitude is such an essential foundation of our Christian life because it's core to who God is. God wants to bless what we do. He's a rewarder of those who seek him when he knows why we're doing it. Heart motive, authentic love for God means everything to God. So when we're able to say, God, I'm so thankful for what you've done for me, let me give something back. Here's some time. Here's a little talent. Here's some treasure. Whatever it is, our life, it's everything to him. So our path of gratitude that we learn through generosity, I've found in my life, it's through 3 steps. Here's the first one. The first thing we have to do is prioritize our purpose. And that's because the Grinch of greed is a tough taskmaster. He won't let go of our hearts easily. So we have to take a definitive, strategic, manageable step. We have to decide that we are going to invest in God's eternal kingdom before we spend it all on our earthly kingdom, because that's what we'll do. That's why it says, first, we're going to decide to invest in God's kingdom first before we spend the rest of it. And we're going to determine to do this. It becomes our default priority. So we say to ourselves, okay, in 2024, I will look for opportunities to avail myself, to invest myself, to invest my life, to invest my time, my talent, my treasure, all that in God's eternal kingdom. So I am definitively, strategically deciding to step onto the narrow path that leads to life, which leads us to step 2. Step 2, plan your percentage. What do you mean? Well, that is to say, you get to decide how much of your time, talent, and treasure you want to invest. In other words, what percentage of your discretionary time, talent, money, your treasures, will you invest in things eternal? It's your call. It's your call and decision. I mean, the opportunities obviously abound around us all the time, and we've been hearing about a third service, the need for more people to serve that service so more people can come. We've been hearing from Jen and Brian a few weeks ago about missions to Peru and around the world. And last week, my wife took one of the little things off the tree, the little decorator. And yesterday, she was buying stuff for a 6-year-old, and she showed me what she had. I mean, from little to large, there's all these things that are always around us. I get that. But here's the thing. You personally have to have peace in your heart about how much of your time, how much of your talent, how much of your treasure you decide you're going to give, you're going to invest, because no one else gets to decide that but you. No one tells you what to do. You decide. And truly, for most of us, that discretionary amount regarding time and talent and so forth, treasure, it increases with the seasons of our life, which brings me to our third step. Prepare for progression. See, most folks in their youth need to start small. Why? Because they deal with cost of education. They're starting at the bottom of the salary range of where they're working. They're raising kids, all the expenses of that for a couple decades, all that. It doesn't leave much margin. I get it. Been there, done that. So as we grow older, though, and the kids get older, we're not taking care of them 24/7. They go to school. They're now finally raised and making their own living and so forth. We gain not only more time, but more financial margin. We ourselves move up in our individual jobs and careers and so forth. So what happens? Well, we have more financial discretionary time and money and so forth. So what do? Well, we don't just increase the amount, we increase the percentage of the amount that we give away as God increases our blessing. And this really is what Jesus meant when he said it's more blessed to give than to receive. That is so counterintuitive. I mean, believe me. Greed says, that's crazy. It's what you grab onto and hold. That's what counts. No. He says it's more blessed to give than receive. Why? Because generosity is the path to the contentment of gratitude and the faith confidence that God is actually multiplying our gratitude, our little, our average, and he's doing that exponentially for his glory and our good. Remember the story I just told you about Kimball, 1858? Let me bring that home to you. 100 years later, not 1858, but 1958, not in Boston, but in San Francisco, Graham came to the Cow Palace and preached a crusade. To that crusade, a young woman, really a teenager, named Ruth, along with her Christian parents, brought her boyfriend Jim to hear Graham preach. And at those crusades, Jim trusted Christ. They later married, and in deciding what to do, they actually moved from California to Denmark, where Ruth's family was from, and had family there with businesses, and they worked there for a few years. But eventually they decided to migrate back to California, to the Central Valley, Northern Valley actually. And as they were deciding which path to take, what jobs to do, and where he would go, Jim's dad, who had opened a furniture store and was starting it, said to him, "Jim, why don't you and your sister Linda and your respective spouses take over this furniture store because, I'm ready to retire. I've been doing this my whole life." And they talked about that and decided that's what they would do. So Jim and his wife and their little kids decide to move out to this out-of-the-way desert town of Fallon, Nevada in the early 1970s. And there they joined a local church where they met this young Sunday school superintendent and adult Sunday school teacher and all that, this young farmer named Dave, who was, in that season, wrestling with which kingdom he would prioritize for his own life. Well, as God would have it, Dave left his kingdom, his own kingdom, and went back east with his young family to seminary to go into ministry. Upon graduation, he returned home to his home church to be ordained. And during that whole period of time, through a series of God events, which is another story at a different time, he was asked to preach at this church in Chico, which had just had their pastor resign after a tumultuous 16th month tenure. And so he came and he preached, and then he came back and preached again. And then the first of the next year, he came back and candidated, in which he said to them that they need to be very careful about picking him because he had been thinking and praying about this for some time, and that he had decided that he wanted his first church to be his last church. He was going to put down roots and allow ministry to grow. And so he became the pastor of that church for the next 40 years. And every time Dave preached in Chico, Jim and Ruth's heavenly video gets longer. Every time God's grace brings anything good out of this ministry, Kimball's 1858 video gets compounded and his heavenly video is lengthened and multiplied for the glory of God. Folks, is this not the most amazing investment opportunity that you have ever heard? And one day will see? But see, it all starts with our faith choice. Will it be gratitude or greed that motivates us? Will it be faith in a future gain that we can't even see or imagine yet? Or will it be fear of present loss? The question that we each one must answer each and every day is this. You listening? Here's the question. The question each one of us must ask and answer for ourselves is this. What do I want my future heavenly video to look like? What do I want my future heavenly video to look like? Do I want it to be one that God has compounded exponentially through my gratitude and generosity? Or one that I have compromised and shrunken in size by the Grinch of greed? My prayer and hope for each one of you here is that your heavenly video one day when you see it, you are going to stand back and say, wow, I never imagined. I couldn't ever imagine or comprehend, conceptualize how you, God, in your supernatural love and unconditional love, could take my little average, my little mites, my little lunches, my little 10 minutes here and 20 minutes there and whatever, and do all that by your supernatural love and grace. My prayer is that you'll be able to look at your video and say, wow, glory to God.